Okay, it's Kaya, and I'm talking about episode 1 of You on Netflix. So in the first episode, like any other pilot, there's going to be some introductions. We find out that Joe and Beck live in the city, and Joe works at a bookstore, and Beck is an English major and TA. Basically, I just want to talk about their specific character, gender stereotypes, as long as like with some of the supporting characters. Joe is seen as on one side, I mean, he's obviously a stalker and is a little bit crazy, as we learned throughout the episode and the season. But Joe is a protector. He's someone who is portrayed as smarter, one step ahead than Beck throughout the episode. He is a provider. And we see this throughout the episode. At one point, Joe helps the boy Paco, who lives in his building. He helps provide him food. He helps take him out for books in order to get him away from his single mother that is with a protective boyfriend. Those are one of the minor characters that I was talking about that still shows those stereotypes. Paco's mom being a weak woman that needs a man by her side and continuously gets back with him even though he beats her, and the boyfriend being this strong man who is able to have power over women. May not be smarter, but is able to have that type of power. And Joe has this as well. When he thinks that he needs to protect and have power over Beck's life, several times throughout the episode, he says, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to cook for you when we're dating. I'm going to do our laundry. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to give you the life that you want. All of these things that Beck never asked for. Mind you, Beck doesn't actually know Joe. They met one time at his bookstore in this apparently very sexualized encounter that Joe seemed was very sexualized. He sexualized her even in the first couple minutes of the show. She's not wearing a bra, and he says, bold move, she wants me to notice. She's super nice and smiles, and Joe, along with his friend who works at the bookstore, immediately think like, this girl's flirting. She wants it. When there's really no indication that she does. A smile and being nice and being dressed in nice clothes doesn't mean that you want to get with someone or you want to pursue a relationship based on one encounter. And then as the episode goes on, he saves her from the train when she falls in the tracks after he's been stalking her and following her, and she is too drunk while texting a guy, kind of putting women, again, in this, like, naive type of, look, because here she is drunk, being irresponsible, texting some guy that she wants to be in love with. Like, this whole episode, to me, put women, and Beck specifically, doing everything for the men. He says, like, oh, she wants me to notice, meaning she wants him to notice. She wants a man to notice. Later in the episode, he talks about her Instagram. It's bikinis and drinking and yoga, all these feminine things. Like, those are for him to see attractive. Those are for men to be attracted to. You see her weakness when Benji comes over after he, I think, was getting a blowjob from someone else at a party that Beck had brought him to, and she takes him back because she has that weak, that stereotypical weak, naive girl. Naive also when Joe walks past her house and sees that she has windows completely open. She's having sex with Benji in the window. She's getting dressed in front of the windows, like doing yoga, whatever, but also even masturbating in front of the windows. And he's saying, like, oh, you're so naive. You want people to watch. It's just putting women in this really negative light, because it's saying that they're not strong enough or independent enough or even smart enough to care for themselves. And as he continued to say over the episode, I'm going to take care of you, and then he takes Benji into his custody below the bookstore, and he says, like, I want to give you the best life that you deserve, to, like, Beck. It just is confusing because men may think that women want to be saved and women need to be taken care of, but there was no point in the entire story or the entire show line that says that she needs help. And he continues to sexualize her and paint her as someone who's naive and needs protecting in order to justify the fact that he is doing these things. And I just think that was very significant to talk about their stereotypes specifically, because that's something that we see so much today. And I think a lot of people fall into that and kind of trip themselves off. And this is why men think this way and women think this way. And it's portrayed like this within the show.
In episode 2 of You, entitled The Last Nice Guy in New York, we see Beck and Joe's relationship expand, and they go on their first date. One of the biggest themes throughout this episode was Beck's relationship with her professor, who we see is a little pervy in the first episode, a little touchy. And in this episode, he asks her to get drinks with him to discuss her poetry, and at the restaurant, he makes his move where he first touches her hand, and then he touches her leg under the table, slowly starting to get a feel, and then she freaks out, and then he immediately reverts to saying, you invited me to, you flirt with me, you were close so sheer I can see your nipples, and he blames it on her, saying it's her fault, for dressing a certain way or behaving a certain way, that this meant she wanted to have sex with him. And this is just obviously a pressing issue in culture where women are getting blamed for having a shirt too low or showing too much skin, being labeled a slut, and making that a reason to lead to sexual harassment. But then they close this part of the plot pretty well, where Beck goes and stands up against the professor, uniting with 7 other women with a similar story against him, kind of standing up against this harassment. And then a couple other themes that pop up throughout the episode. One being the whole women validating themselves via social media. We see this in Beck and her friends having all these pictures of themselves on Instagram and caring so much about how they're portrayed in the public eye, except maybe that it's a fake facade, and that they care so much about it, blah, blah, blah. And then another comment, a small comment in the episode, was when Joe went over Peach's house for a party, and she is telling him making yourself at home, and she makes a comment that says, brown people don't bite, and she says it as a joke, as in Brown, the college, alumni, but it's first played off like brown people, I guess, and she kind of says it totally normally, doesn't see how that could be an issue, while Joe is a little taken back on how to react to a sensitive comment like that. And I think there's a lot you could talk about with race in this instance, actually. Finally, another point I would like to talk about is there's a scene where Peach and Beck are getting ready for a party, and we see Peach dressed up in her black lace underwear and matching bra, and that's definitely not something that people often wear just around the house or just because they're going to a party. It's just not a thing, and I think it's included because I'm going to connect it to this film theorist's work, Laura Mulvey, who does something about the male gaze theory, and essentially, in a nutshell, she's saying this idea of that men do the looking and women are to be looked at in cinema, and that women in the media are viewed from the eyes of a heterosexual man while they're represented as these passive objects. And I think this show kind of enforces this idea in moments like this, and when you see Beck getting dressed in a lot of scenes throughout the show, but I think it's definitely something that could be talked about.
This is episode 3, titled Maybe. This episode was centered on Beck deciding if Joe is the one, and he sets out to prove to her that he isn't just a maybe and his boyfriend material. Although while trying to prove to Beck that he's the one for her, he experienced some struggles along the way. This episode depicts many different examples of gender stereotypes between Beck and Joe's relationship. It also shows a common theme throughout the episode that women are so reliant on a man and always need their comfort. During many different scenes, Beck asks Joe questions that require his support. For example, she asked him if she is remarkable and if she's good enough. which also indirectly can portray her as comparing it to her own life and her relationship with Joe, indirectly questioning if she's good enough for him. She also opens up to Joe that she's afraid of writing and procrastinates her assignments due to her fear of failure. Joe continues to make her feel worthy and assures her that things will be okay. This falls into the stereotype of women being insecure and needing a male figure to reassure that they are good enough and be that shoulder to lean on to comfort women. Also, the stereotype of women being so timid and afraid to take chances because they're so worried they're going to fail. A similar example that happened in the episode was when Joe asked Beck a personal and vulnerable questions where she opens up to him. At the end, you see Beck become very frustrated that he hasn't opened up about anything in his life and who he is as a person to Beck. And this could relate to women always being portrayed as vulnerable compared to men who always have a front and aren't necessarily showing any emotion. Lastly, another example of how the stereotypical theme is portrayed was at the end of the episode. Beck was asking Peach about her thoughts on Joe. Peach expresses her concern about Joe's occupation of being a manager at the bookstore and how he won't be a good fit for her because he won't be able to financially support her in the future. This relates to the stereotype of women needing a man to support them and that money is the main focus of what a woman is attracted to in a man.
Hey guys, I'm Casey Picard. I'm going to be talking to you about episode 5 of You today. So basically episode 5, a lot goes down. The episode starts with an embarrassing and reputation-ending video of Annika getting released. Joe immediately suspects that Peach leaked the video. Beck eventually suspects her as well. The episode continues where Peach connects Beck to a literary agent, but essentially is only setting her up to fail. She tells the agent that Beck has a lot to learn and purposely belittles Beck to the agent. And then later, at the end of the episode, Peach fakes a suicide attempt as a cry for Beck's attention. As soon as Peach calls Beck for help, Joe and Beck immediately go over to help her. And while there, Joe finds Peach's food log, and she logged what she tried to overdose with, and it was essentially just ibuprofen. So Joe realizes that Peach is crying wolf and faking the whole thing. Peach's plan works perfectly, though. She manipulates Beck into not calling the hospital and staying with her for the night. The episode continues with Beck meeting the literary agent, and at first he seems cool and he's gonna help her, but then later he tries to sexually assault her in the back of a limo, and then even offers her drugs to get her to calm down so that she'll sleep with him. So the three main themes of episode 5 that perpetuate stereotypes and other stigmas in society that are common today are, you have the abusive male figure. You can see that with the power struggle between Joe and Peach. Joe uses abuse to try and gain control over both Beck and Peach. So he tries to at first he tries to just tell Beck that Peach is lying, but then at the end of the episode he actually tries to kill Peach. He hits her over the head with a rock in Central Park, or in a park. So clearly these are more examples of an abusive male figure. There's also an example of a manipulative female figure, kind of like the teenage bitchy backstabbing type of figure. You can see that with Peach. She's possessive and jealous. She plays the victim to manipulate Beck right after purposely sabotaging Beck. So it's as soon as Beck gets mad at her, she immediately tricks Beck into liking her again. And then another stereotypical figure that you can see is the clueless victim female figure. So that's kind of the damsel in distress role, which is played by Beck. And you can see it, both Joe and Peach think they need to control aspects of Beck's life. They both claim it's to make her life better, but she unwittingly is a victim to both of them. And then these themes you can apply to modern culture today. So the abusive male figures. Recently, Kareem Hunt, within the past 2 years, there was a video. He's a football player in the NFL, and there was a video release of him beating a woman. He pushes her to the ground and kicks her and stuff. And essentially, no real consequences have been given to him. He was technically suspended, but he was just signed with another team, so he's getting paid. He's still in the league. And this kind of perpetuates that stereotype of just boys being boys and guys can do whatever they want and get away with it. This also ties into the rape culture that we have in America. The kind of female victim, damsel in distress. You see it with the recent Me Too movement. So Beck is kind of a symbol for that because the Me Too movement is women speaking out about sexual abuse in the workplace, and Beck is kind of a victim of that because she can't really continue down the avenue. Like, she thought she was going to have a big break, but the literary agent only wanted sexual favors from her before he was even going to attempt to help her.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about episode 6. I'm going to be focusing on the characterization of the character Peach specifically. So to begin the episode, her character is very stereotypical because she's a pretty woman and she believes that she's a stalker. And because she's so obsessed with herself, she fits right into the mean girl stereotype and completely believes that she does have a stalker. It also ties in with her playing this damsel in distress character very well. In previous episodes, we learned that Peach was attacked in a park by this stalker that she claims to have, which we know is Joe Goldberg, but she does not know that. So Beck is taking care of her, but not so much as a mother figure, more of like taking on that role that a significant other would. This plays into the idea of homosociality, which was popularized by Eve Sedgwick. It's a theory that same-sex relationships, they're like hardcore friendships that include everything a sexual relationship would include, like cuddling and sharing intimate feelings and going on dates, etc., but not the sexual part. And she wrote about this in her work, Male Homosocial Desire, mostly relating to men's relationships, but here in this episode we can see it very clearly in females' relationships with Beck and Peach. In the way that she buys her tickets to go to Paris with her, which is known as like a typically romantic destination. She is always grabbing her hand, cooking her breakfast, buying her outfits to put on. Just seems very reminiscent of like a relationship. Also, later on in the episode, while they're at their house in Greenwich, she attempts to have like sexual relations with her, but has a man involved because she knows that that's the only way that Beck would ever get involved with her. Also, throughout this episode, Joe and Peach are both fighting for Beck's attention, which is usually not the case. You usually see two guys fighting for a girl's attention, but here it's different, and Joe's trying to create this narrative of women going against each other, and Beck's just too blinded by her friendship with Peach to see what's really going on, which obviously leads into her being just too caring and that's her fault as a woman. Also with Beck, another total cliche of her being like an aspiring basic writer who's mostly mediocre at best but lives under the ability of her parents' trust fund, and it's okay. And at the end of the episode, Beck has already left the house, and Joe and Peach get into a little altercation, and Peach shoots Joe in the leg but doesn't kill him completely because she's a woman and that would just be too barbaric, but it ends up faulting her because he isn't really dead, and he grabs her and ends up killing her.
In episode 7 of You, entitled Everything Ship, there are a myriad of ways in which gender is portrayed. Through the lens of characters Beck and Joe, we learn a lot about gender norms in society in New York City in 2018. One pertinent example is the use of social media. While at the bookstore, Beth posts a picture on Instagram of her and Joe. In general, the common portrayal is of women using social media heavily in order to either validate themselves or find out as much information about others as possible. This can be seen throughout all of Beth's friend group. In viewing their accounts, you can learn a lot about them. On the contrary, Joe does not even have any social media accounts. Another topic that shows the disparity between genders is the use of therapy. Beck is very excited to go to therapy, and she finds it to be very beneficial. Women tend to be depicted as more in favor of using therapy than men. In this episode specifically, Beck is portrayed as a stereotypical, complicated woman who believes that nobody understands her feelings, so she keeps them to herself and believes that the only way that she can really get some clarity is through the therapy. Joe also sees the same therapist that Beck does, but only as a means to snoop on her and keep a tab on her. This, along with other things Joe does, such as following Beck through the city, point to his controlling nature. Men often are depicted as controlling and wanting as much power as possible. There are certain aspects of relationships and personal feelings that are simply uncontrollable, but Joe continuously tries to fix her. While Joe is so fixated on Beck's social habits, he goes and sleeps with his neighbor the night that he and Beck broke up. This points to the stereotypical man always wanting to go for a rebound after a relationship ends. Men and women value relationships differently and do not always necessarily understand how the other feels. These gender associations lead to friction in Joe and Beck's relationship and may unfairly depict the genders.
Hey guys, it's Casey. I'm back again to tell you about episode 10, the finale of season 1 of You on Netflix. So this episode opens with a flashback to scenes of Joe being abused by the father figure in his life, Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney keeps repeating, "Who am I to you?" And he mentions Joe's abusive father, who apparently burned him as a child. The episode continues with Celia getting sent to the hospital in an ambulance because Ron has hit her so badly she's injured her neck and has a concussion. Then we see another flashback of Joe starting to idolize Mr. Mooney despite his abuse. Mooney claims that he only locks Joe in the cage because he loves him, so a young Joe starts to believe him. So this kind of gives a background as to explain Joe's behavior, and it kind of starts to plant sympathy in viewers' minds. It shows Joe as a victim, and it sort of attempts to justify his unjustifiable behavior. Beck decides to start writing while she's locked in the box because she doesn't really see another way out. Her thoughts narrate the show as the scenes play out through a flashback of her multiple relationships, and she begins to blame herself. She narrates what happens, and she says, "Didn't I ask for this? Isn't this what I wanted?" She sort of blames the fairy tale Prince Charming fantasy. She was looking so hard for someone perfect that when she found him, she completely missed the fact that Joe was a psycho. It's kind of like a victim blaming type situation. Beck writes up the whole story of her and Joe and everything that happened, but she twists it so that they can blame everything on the psychiatrist, Dr. Nikki, who Beck cheated on Joe with. And Beck then tries to use sympathy and love to manipulate Joe, to trick Joe into entering the cage, kind of like using sex as a weapon, but she just hugs him and kisses him. They don't actually have sex. So she lures him in and then stabs him with something that a letter that she took out of the typewriter, and then locks him in the cage, but he has a spare key, so he escapes. She hits him with a hammer and runs up the stairs, but Paco, who has witnessed Joe kill Ron earlier in the episode, sees Beck, and instead of letting her out, he realizes that Joe's the one keeping her trapped, and he now trusts Joe since Joe murdered Ron, and he turns away and leaves Beck locked in the basement. The episode ends with Joe killing Beck, and then he releases the novel, and basically everything gets blamed on Dr. Nikki. So Beck is now dead, Dr. Nikki's in jail, and Joe's home free. So the main themes of episode 10 are, again, the abusive male theme that we've seen in a couple episodes, but now we sort of see the idealization of them. So Joe idolized Mooney, and you see Paco idolizes Joe. So it's interesting, it portrays Joe as sort of a savior for Paco, which is kind of messed up because he's a serial killer. So I think that it can be applied kind of again to today. Viewers start to have sympathy for Joe. They sort of start to root for him, even though he's literally a serial killer. And then another major theme of this episode is kind of the female victim blaming. So you see this with rape cases, oh, it was her fault, it's what she was wearing. You kind of see the hint of that in here. So in this episode, Joe blames Celia for staying with Ron and kind of yells at her because Ron hits her, but he doesn't know the whole story. Celia explains to Joe that Ron threatened to take Paco away from her. So then Joe kind of realizes, it's on Ron, it's not on Celia. And then the other main instance of victim blaming is when Beck blames herself for not realizing how crazy Joe was.